Well, in the interest of time, we'll just get started. I'm Richard Fleming. I'm the co-owner and director for Sage Media and Sage Academy. Both are businesses that use storytelling to drive learning and behavior change. So prior to actually running these companies, I was a filmmaker and a commercial director. And I found that my journey to finding my own voice or to becoming a storyteller is actually very similar to the same problem of becoming a learning designer, or the same problems that learning designers encounter. So I want to walk through kind of what my journey was and some of the things I learned as you start to develop your own unique voice as a storyteller. Do you mind? The cat? Yep, thank you. So we have some cat action in the background, as you can all imagine. It's very noisy. Okay, so I wanted to start with this quote by Flannery O'Connor, because really when I embraced becoming a storyteller, there was a number of things that happened. Like as a filmmaker, I think of myself as, a cinematographer, a director, but being a storyteller was not part of that conversation. And there's a lot of gatekeeping in the TV and film community. So as I'm researching this stuff, I'm finding a lot of people, like 90% of the books, surprisingly, would tell me, you either have talent or you don't. And I didn't. And so I often would ask myself questions about ability, my own personal ability, and even kind of misinterpreted this quote, which I think speaks a beautiful truth that stories are difficult when you sit down to write them. But the message I was getting was I was not worth being able to tell stories. And so I spent a lot of time like figuring out what good storytelling looked like. I knew what it looked like, but I just wasn't there yet. And I'm a growth mindset person. So my thought was, I certainly should be able to learn about this. The resources I was looking up though for storytelling all had this kind of common problem. They didn't have a practical framework. They were very rooted in their own kind of academic sphere. So not only would I find stuff that was on either end of the spectrum, it would either be completely simplistic, like a story has to have a beginning, middle, and end, which is like, obviously, but how does it help me tell a story better? On the opposite side, you'd have these really convoluted terms and people would have their own secret language. One author would refer to a character arc, whereas another author would refer to the same thing as a spine. A third author would refer to it as a third rail. And so it became like really maddening and disheartening to be, seeing all these disparate pieces of information being thrown out and no one really knowing what the score was. I had a friend who lent me this book that was probably the biggest resource for help, and it combined philosophy with storytelling principles. But the irony was you had to understand Hegel's dialectic to really get through it or understand it. And I don't know if you've spent time on philosophy forums or chat boards, but Hegel's dialectic is still a much heated debate. And so I needed to find out like if there was some kind of middle ground. I went back and studied, Homer and Persian folk tales and the Haida Gwaii up in the Victoria Islands, master storytellers. And I had to figure like, these people were doing it right. Clearly they weren't getting some, talented tribesmen every single time to pass along this information. Like there had to be some kind of process by which they were teaching this and conveying this information. And it reminds me of kind of like the same objectives that we're dealing with. So I'm trying to figure out like how to keep attention, how to extend retention. These are all things, if you look at this grid here, these are all things that you as a learning designer also suffer. And so I put these in brackets because just to kind of sell the point, but I think it's worth noting that as facilitators, coaches, consultants, et cetera, we have the same goals. And so I want you to kind of like take a breath and relax about what this process is going to look like, because storytelling isn't as complicated, but we do have some serious complicated problems. So in addition to these questions, we also have like, how do we save time not generating all of this creative stuff just that falls flat for people? How do we have learners finish courses and up our engagement? How do we, once they finish the course, take that action and do it in the field? And predominantly the last two bullets, integrating complex topics and nudging behaviors, are of note, because I moved into learning design from storytelling because I found that storytelling was doing these things already. So if you have sales training and you're trying to get your salespeople to roll out like stories about their UVP or their unique value proposition, how do you get them to tell a story that's compelling to a prospect on the fly? How do you have them collect things that are relevant to negotiation, right? These are all very complicated things that are not as simple as, well, let me tell you about the time that Jimmy didn't wash his hands and what happened. We needed a framework that was far more robust, and storytelling is that framework. The second thing I'll mention for bullet number 6 is that I started studying this field called neurocinematics. And it's basically a cognitive science field that uses film theory to kind of explain how media interacts with the brain. And this was not, I was like every other artist of being like, my art's going to change the world. But the reality was there was actual the practical measurable impacts that media was having on the brain. So you're in the right spot. I just want to like kind of start this off by giving you that, and to kind of remind you of the process, right? This is not as complicated as it may seem. That reminds me of this Zen koan that Bruce Lee adopted into his own kind of practice. And someone had asked him, well, what was your journey as a fighter? He said, well, when I started martial arts, a punch was just a punch and a kick was just a kick. Then I started to get really good at it, and a punch became more than a punch, and a kick was so much more than a kick. Now that I have mastered the fighting form, a punch is just a punch, and a kick is just a kick. So similarly, I want us to kind of like sit back and relax. That's when I had this epiphany that what the problem with the way that storytelling was designed wasn't because that it was this inaccessible thing. It was the way it was being taught. Teachers were trying to, and they're great teachers, but they were trying to create a linear process for something that is circuitous and iterative. Now, aspects of it are certainly linear. And the thing that has been overlooked is the thing I'm going to teach you today. This is the core foundation of how stories are built, and it's something that 98% of storytellers and learning designers miss. So it's probably more learning designers than storytellers, but storytellers do actually forget this. I'll start with a story to illustrate the point. A man asks his son to help him take the donkey to market. They're going to sell it. As they're walking to the market, this old woman sees them walking next to the donkey, and she's like, are you guys stupid? Like, this animal's designed to carry stuff. Why are you walking next to it? So they look at each other and like, all right, well, you know, the old man gets on, he's riding along, and then some woman stops and is like, how dare you just take advantage of your son's youth? Like, what kind of entitlement is this? He gets off and switches with his son, and no further than a couple paces, and someone else says, you know, why are you letting your poor old father walk? It's a long journey. Two of them are frustrated and decide, you know what? We're going to carry the donkey. Then no one will bother us. Maybe they'll think it's injured or something. So they lash its legs to a pole and they walk along with it. Sure enough, no one bothers them. But as they cross a bridge, the donkey, upside down, sees the water rushing and freaks out, starts kicking around, knocks one of them over, and falls off the bridge and into the water where it drowns. An old man who watched the entire spectacle unfold laughs and says, serves you right. What's this story about? So in the comments, tell me, what's the moral of this story? What do you glean from this? Just try to summarize it in a sentence or two. Don't worry about what other people think. You shouldn't care so much about what other things. Great, great. These are awesome. Influence, social pressure, perspectives are different. Great. Yeah, what happens when you're swayed by others' opinions? Awesome. Okay, these are great. This summary, this pithy summary sentence that Aesop, who created the story, he used, try pleasing all and end up pleasing none. That's the moral of the story as we refer to it. But this is actually what's referred to as a core premise. And every single story has a single core premise. It's what the story is really about. If you ask somebody, you know, what's this movie about? What's the new Marvel movie about? Often they'll tell you the action or the plot of it. They'll tell you like what sequence of events unfolds. Oh, you know, Thanos, he like snaps his fingers and half the people go away and blah, blah, blah. Not too early for spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie, I'm sorry. But that's not the core premise. That's not what the story is really about. It's about like, how do you manage finite resources? What's this utilitarian view? You can kind of get philosophical with it. Now, while Aesop is very overt in explaining his core premise, us as storytellers are not going to be that obvious. We're going to work at kind of disguising this, and we're also going to find stories that align with the core premises that best prove our story. This is how you weave storytelling into your learning design. You first have to know what a core premise is. So that's the first step, right? And if you're referring to the printout that we sent out, the email, this is a great opportunity for you to workshop some of your own learning objectives. So make sure that you've got that in hand. All right. But the reason that I mention this is because all stories teach us something. That's why they exist. They are another vessel by which to transfer information. And they do so based on this core premise. So we need to understand the architecture or the structure of a core premise, and we need to be able to use it in common parlance. So let's start by analyzing what the structure is of a core premise and giving a couple examples. It consists of three basic aspects. You have a moral trait, you have a conflict with that trait, and you have a conclusion that results through that conflict. A moral trait is nothing more than a virtue or a vice. It's a human characteristic. So think of like greed, ambition, infidelity, fastidiousness, all these different aspects that are, qualities of human nature that are celebrated or, criticized by ancient philosophers. That inherently has conflict with the outcome. So if the outcome is something bad, like for example, in the case of the donkey, the outcome is bad, we can surmise that the thing that they're doing, the moral trait, is going to be something bad. It's a vice. If it's a happy ending, then the moral trait is something that we want characters to embody. That's how I structure stories. So in the case of Aesop's story, I would summarize this in a different sentence, and I would phrase it as people pleasing pleases no one, right? People pleasing leads to no one being pleased. So other popular examples would be Shakespeare's Macbeth, right? We look at Macbeth as a ruthlessly ambitious character. Ambition is what gets him ahead. He knows he's going to inherit the kingdom if he does these things, and he does them. And as a result, it leads to his own death. So the sentence structure that I would use is ambition leads to ruin. Ambition leads to death, right? We're creating these causal statements, and we want to get familiar with this. So I'll give another example, another Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is a master at this. Othello. You have this character, this warlord. You don't need to know the story too well, but Othello is this very popular warlord who loves his wife Desdemona, and this kind of obnoxious guy, Iago, hints that maybe she's unfaithful to him. And because he's such a jealous person, he flies off the handle, ends up killing her, and realizes his mistakes, that she wasn't unfaithful. So Shakespeare's telling a cautionary tale. He's saying, if you are jealous, then you will destroy the object of your affection. Jealousy leads to, or jealousy destroys the object of its affection, right? We're giving this kind of causal moral trait, conflict, and conclusion. Why is this important? Because the fact that storytellers are teaching you through this way, and you don't necessarily even know it, it's not overt, you want the same power in your learning objectives. If you just tell people, hey, you stop wasting time, or you got to wash your hands, they're resistant. So we're utilizing a little bit of motivation theory, which is a really powerful learning design tool. All right, let's actually go through this. So pull out the checklist and let's workshop from a learning objective, because now that you know what a core premise is, and you have a good sense of what it is, these are not absolute truths, you're just things that you want to prove in the context of your story. We're going to translate our learning objective into a core premise so that we can find other premises that match. And now we've got ways for you to integrate stories into your learning objective after that. So I went online and I searched a couple different things, and I found this, and it's got some problems, but I think it's mostly what we would see in a needs assessment or needs analysis. So it says that all heavy equipment operators must complete safety and operational training for appropriate licensing. Now you can put whatever learning objective you want, but if you're going through the worksheet, I listed two things. So as an analyst, we are going to start from left to right. We're going to start with the moral trait, what the conflict is, and then the conclusion as we're acquiring different stories. But as a writer, we actually flip the script. We go backwards. We start with a conclusion, and that will help us inform what the moral trait is going to be. So the first question I have for you, and let's actually put this out as another thing to submit to the chat, is what's the worst thing that can happen if people don't complete the safety and operational training? You don't need to know anything about this, but if you've done a needs analysis correctly, then you're going to have a lot of options to be able to find out what the worst possible thing is going to be. So let's give some examples. People are not operating heavy machinery. What could happen? Death, injury, yeah, don't get licensed. Lawsuits, lose a limb, accidents. You can creatively ideate a bunch of stuff, right? People get hurt. Now, this could be specific to your organization. Let's say I'm working with a distributor of eco-friendly products, and there's not a whole lot of personal interaction, meaning that someone dying is pretty unlikely. So that doesn't necessarily speak to the audience. Either way, we've got a bunch of lists of things that could go wrong. But I might say that for my particular culture in this eco-friendly environment, waste would be a real problem. Specifically, obscene amounts of waste. Like if they have to throw stuff in the landfill, that really hurts them. And that means I'm connecting to the core mission of my learners. What would really impact them? That's what I'm thinking through. So I've got my learning objective. I've asked myself, well, what happens if they don't? That would impact my learner. That would impact them emotionally. So for mine, I'm going to choose obscene waste. Now that we know that it's going to be a bad ending, something negative is going to happen, all we have to focus on are some vices. We don't, right? If it's a positive ending, then we want the virtues. But for right now, we're just focusing on what weakness, bias, or vice is interfering with our learners currently doing the thing, currently going through and completing the safety and operational training. Again, this is a hypothetical, so we're just throwing out ideas, but I think this is a healthy exercise to practice. What are some flaws that learners have that prevent them from doing the thing that you want them to do? And you can even put in your own of things that you know about your own learners. What are some vices that they have? What are some biases? Yep. So let's be a little bit more specific. These are great. So we have attitude towards it, right? So bad attitude. They're saving time. So maybe they're rushed, or maybe they're overly efficient, or cutting corners, or sloppy. But we want things like, instead of just saying that they don't know, we want things like ignorance, or not a priority. So carelessness, maybe, Katie, right? Like we're trying to get something more about a quality of their essence. Arrogance, right? What leads to that obscene waste? What behavior are they engaging in that's problematic? And we're talking about it from the lens of a moral trait, from a vice. Lack of integrity, great. Lack of integrity is great. Arrogance is a good one, yep. Sorry, not to pat myself on the back. Don't want to spend time completing the training. That's great, Sarah. And I would even add, like, they know the risks, they know what's at stake, and they just don't care. So if they don't care, that's the very definition of recklessness, right? So I'm going to summarize that as recklessness. Now we have a core premise, right? Don't believe that the risks are real. Lack of conscientiousness. This is awesome. These are all the things that we want to generate. We want to generate these strong, poignant moral traits. So let's say we're going to summarize this as recklessness leads to obscene waste. That's the thing I need to prove. That's the core premise of my learning objective. Stop for a second and think about the implications here. We've got a learning objective that is radically different in the way it's listed as this sentence is here. But these things relate, right? The learning objective is how it's going to manifest. This is the why it matters. And that's why we need to do this exercise, because learning designers don't naturally just come to this conclusion. This is hard work. This is hard for Hollywood producers. They don't do this kind of stuff. They skip it, and then they end up having a movie that ends and you're like, what was that about? Like, that didn't make any sense. That's why it didn't make any sense. They didn't do this homework. So now when you walk out of a bad movie, you'll know why. So in this, the worksheet, you've gone through and said, why doesn't the learner do this thing? You've stated, therefore, the conclusion. And then you fill in, well, what's the virtue of or vice that's preventing them from taking this action? Now you have the moral trait. All you have to do is write in that moral trait leads to that conclusion. So you can do this with your own. If you've got something and you know, like I absolutely know that my learners, it will result in them losing their job. It will result in them hurting themselves. It will result in them, losing time or money. And the result is because of this moral trait, right? So you can fill this in and now you've got this. That's it. That's the secret sauce. And this is more than, again, 98% of what people do. Yeah, you're setting up a crisis for them to avoid is a great way of putting it, Gene. You're also giving them some incentive. So if you want to inspire them, you tell them a positive story. If you're honest, it will lead to success. So honesty leads to success, right? We're just kind of creating these causal statements, if then. So all you got to do at this point is go out and buy, some kind of journal. And this is where you're going to collect stories. Now, think about it for a second. Let's even just sit here. Now, I will set a Pomodoro timer for about 25 minutes, and I will do this uninterrupted. I will write down the core premise that I want to prove on the heading of one of the pages, and then I will actually go through and write down as many stories as I can, uninterrupted. What you'll find, even as we're naturally thinking about this, Samia, the guide was sent to you. The worksheet was sent to you, but I can send you a follow-up if that's helpful. Well, I'll give you my email address. But just for a second, guys, let's actually imagine stories that prove this. If we just sit quietly in an uninterrupted space, we can start coming up with all sorts of ideas that prove that recklessness leads to obscene waste. One thing I'm thinking of is there's that forklift driver. There's a video or a GIF of it where he's driving along and he clips one of the racks and it pulls the rack down, and that rack has this domino effect that rips through all the others, piles him on top of crap. Now, thank God the guy survived, and I think he didn't really have any injuries or they were minimal. But that's a great example of recklessness leading to obscene waste. The amount of rubbish that they had to clean up after the fact was just unbelievable. The BP oil spill is another one. I mean, you could probably modify that to be something more like, greed leads to obscene waste or something like that. But the point is that now you know what the core premise is. And this is key for you because as you're going through this process, these stories are going to start floating to you. We got a question here, and feel free to ask questions if you don't. So Don, you don't have it. Maybe check your spam folder because it was sent about half an hour ago. Should be coming from my email address, richard@sage.media. If not, this will be on replay, and it's pretty self-explanatory, so I don't want you to feel like you're losing anything by not having it. It's just a helpful guide for us to walk through and clarify some things. Yes, Gene, probably did get spaminated. I love that phrase. I'm going to use that now. Okay, so now that we are at the point where you basically have the formula, right? What if you want to create your own story? What if you want to create something from scratch? It's well beyond the scope of what I can cover in this particular webinar, but I'll mention very briefly that we actually built a full course for this. And this course covers a more in-depth view of what the core premise is. It also guides you through the process of creating stories from scratch. So story world, building characters, plotting, all that stuff. I mention it now, not because I want you to do anything about it beyond just, we are doing a pre-sale for it. It's currently being built. So I wanted to offer some beta testers some incentive. This is going to be about $200, but we're offering it to you guys for $97. This is normally a process that businesses pay about 15 grand for us to come in and do, but we're teaching IDs how to do it. I'm going to keep that for about a week. I will send you a follow-up email, so there's nothing you need to do right now, but I wanted to make sure that you knew in case some of the stuff was feeling fuzzy or you really want a paint by numbers approach. there's nothing that exists on the market, and we wanted people to be able to have that linear approach to a circuitous process. So before we get into the do's and don'ts, I just wanted to mention that. This is my favorite section because it's something that we all do. Like I've done this, and so no shame if you've done some of these. I just wanted to point out a couple things because seasoned IDs as well. Like we just fall prey to this because we're rushed and we're, stressed and there's all this stuff going on and we don't have time to think clearly. Let me see here. I just want to make sure I've got, we'll send to you. All right. Now, the first don't I will say is, I mentioned this at the very, very beginning about core premises. There's only one core premise per story. This is critical. Often I will see companies, and maybe it's they want to get more bang for their buck. They put too much into a single story and expect too much of the story. It can't handle that. You have one core premise per story. Otherwise, it becomes tangential, right? I can't prove that recklessness leads to obscene waste, and also timeliness is next to godliness. It'd be like, well, what story would I do that tells both? And it makes your learners confused, and it makes them frustrated. I remember this one example of a company that had a career development center that they wanted to promote. And we had established that what the core premise was going to be was, if you go through this career development center, then you will be successful. And as we started going on with the storytelling, they started adding all this stuff like, well, let's also put in that other people have done it. But I'm like, but that would say, if they've done it, you can do it too, which is a different core premise than I wanted to, like they're separate. Anyway, so as you're going through this process, liken this to designers where they have all this negative space, this white space, and their boss is like, you can put a phone number there or an email there. And you have to just remind them like, no, it's going to clutter and overwhelm the viewer. We need to focus on a simple, singular message. So I'm just giving you that vote of confidence. On the note of trying to make, the biggest bang for the buck, don't worry about budget. I just have to take a brief mention on this image. I've been trying to find a presentation where I could use this for years, and I'm just very happy that I'm allowed to do it now. I don't know what it means, and I hope it, I hope it doesn't confuse you for the rest of the presentation, but anyway, I just needed to mention that and get that out of the way. The closest analogy here to it is budget. Like I want people to not fixate on, yeah, potato market, that's great. Thank you, Robin. Don't focus on budget first because it's a creativity killer. So sometimes on these like ID forums, I'll share some of my work and people will be like, oh, that's great, but I don't have budget for that. It's like, I didn't mention what it costs, and yet they're already starting that. Thanks, Robin, for that vote of confidence. So the idea is, don't worry about the logistics or how the information is going to be presented first. Think about what story is going to emotionally connect with your audience. That's the primary thing that you need to focus on. So budget will come later because you might have a great story that's perfect for an email or perfect for a PowerPoint deck, but you don't know that now. And so you don't want to start working on what the carriage looks like well before the horse, right? Before you have the horse. On that note, I'm a big proponent of creative innovation techniques like foresight and agile. Like I practice creative innovation techniques with my work. And as you're going through your story journal and you're writing down stories, don't revise or collect them or order them and say, well, maybe this one doesn't perfectly apply, so I should move it out or scratch it out. Really just write, free write, get all of your ideas down on paper, and then you can revise and order them and move them around. But I find that too often people not familiar with the creative process get overwhelmed. And so they start to, write and revise at the same time. And I liken that to kind of like putting your foot on the accelerator and the brake at the same time. You go nowhere. All right. What else do we got here? This goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. To not speak down to your learner. Too often, organizations and stakeholders feel that subtext is too demanding, meaning like what someone says is not what they mean. People are really good at figuring that out. We watch content all the time. So it doesn't make any sense for us to talk down to our learners. if you are excited about a project, they will be excited about it too. If you think about something like, would I enjoy watching this? Then you've got a slam dunk. If this is something like, well, this training sucks and they have to do it, they're going to think the same thing. So this is just a reminder that like you're in the right space to kind of be creative and be your creative self. Like this is a great opportunity for you to stretch yourself artistically. And I don't want you to feel beholden to having to like, dumb down your material. Clarity is one thing, but dumbing it down is an entirely different thing. And on that note, I feel it's worth mentioning how you connect to your material. This is a screenshot from a training film I created for a food manufacturer. It's a 40-minute film noir. And this bothered me. This film bothered me. The scene, the opening scene was something I had in a dream. And it's this woman running through a suburban neighborhood and she hears her daughter call to her. And she's trying to find her daughter, but can't. She's like, she hears her voice and she's running around. She ends up in a graveyard and she's running, desperate to find her daughter. Her daughter's calling for help. And she finds this gravestone that's blank and the daughter's voice is coming from the ground. And she's just shocked, like, how did you get in here? And the daughter's like, I don't know, but I'm stuck. I need help. Please get me out of here. And she gets down, she's digging, she's frantic. She's becoming more frantic as the daughter starts to lose air. And she's breaking a nail and the rain's coming in. And she's freaking out, looking around for help. And she turns over and spots these 4 ominous black figures. And they're just standing there. And she says, please help me. My daughter's trapped. Like get her out. And they don't do anything. And she screams at them and then continues to dig. And then becomes completely fatigued, collapses to the ground, stands up, takes a deep breath, calms herself, looks right at the lens and says, this is the part where I usually wake up. And we snap into a therapist office and we realize like this is some nightmare that she's been living since she lost her daughter. That starts the training film. This is a very conservative company. And I thought that they were going to absolutely shoot this down. This is the one thing they had absolutely no mention of because something about it resonated with them. The same reason it bothered me. Who are these 4 figures? Why aren't they helping? What happened to her daughter? How's she going to figure that out? All those things that bothered me bothered them and they wanted them resolved. This movie like makes me emotional. Like I get to the end of it and it bothers me and I made the movie. I shouldn't have that impact, but because I'm letting myself that permission, I want you to also offer that permission to yourself that you don't have to be emotionally insulated from your material. We're human beings. And this process of storytelling is what connects that kind of right-brained, nonverbal, emotional feeling sense to the left brain logical, right? And granted, I know that the brain's not structured that way, but for our purposes, I hope that makes sense to you. So that's all I've got for now. Okay, so I'm being informed that the email did not go out. We will check on that, but either way, I'll follow up because you guys are in the campaign. But I wanted to take time to answer some questions. Thank you, Gene. What's lingering? And if you don't feel comfortable putting a chat in there, by all means, you can actually email me at richard@sage.media. I'll put that up for you. I will follow up with the handout and as well with the discounted link if you guys are interested in pre-buying the full course. Oh, for the actual document? I can't through here. All right. Any questions, anything that was confusing about this process, or do we think we have a good sense of it? All right. How do we get buy-in from stakeholders? Is it best to ideate with them? That's a great question. So again, there's a separate kind of package we're building to help people with design thinking and the needs analysis. But I would say, just to shorten it, you don't need them to necessarily ideate with them unless you section that off. So we will run a guided clarity session with companies. It's about 15 grand and it's a day-long kind of ideation session, but it's very, very segmented. So we even teach the stakeholders what the process is for how you creatively ideate. As long as the expectations are that's where it is, The danger is if you get them in and they start talking about shots they want and you haven't even come up with the story. So you have to be a good facilitator to be able to wrangle those ideas at the right time. The first step in the creative problem solving framework is to clarify. Then you ideate. Then you develop those ideas to pick the most viable one, and then you implement that strategy. So we go through the clarify and the ideate session with stakeholders. Then we go back, and as SMEs and as IDs, we will then develop and implement. Does that make sense? So just to reiterate, you can have two options. You can do a needs analysis, but you don't have to. If you are going to ideate with them, you have to make sure you set the right structure for that meeting, so they're not just kind of throwing out stuff against the wall. Anything else? I'm glad this was easy and clear, Robin. That was the goal. We got a little bit more time, so I don't want to rush anyone. What's lingering? What's been on your mind lately? What would you like to know more about? Adaptations of fairy tales in training, yeah. The thing with fairy tales, there's a really great book by Bettelheim. He was a child psychologist that studied how children respond. Yep, that's exactly how you spell it. Bettelheim. I think it's called like Interpretations of Folklore or something like that. So as a child psychologist, he would see kids come in and they were kind of like all messed up from this Dr. Spock era of, don't tell kids about violence, don't expose them to death. And he found that it was actually having developmental issues. So this one family comes in and they said, he's been having this nightmare about this giant. We read him Jack and the Giant Killer, but we didn't kill the giant. We just called it Jack and the giant. And then he went away. And the guy was like, kill the giant. Like, the giant has to die. Kids need to have that permanence, that binary, it's dead, it's not coming after you. So they went home, read the story to the kid, and then immediately the kid slept like a rock, and could process the relationship that story really had. That's why those Grimm stories are so extreme, is because they're polarized. When you're dealing with adult learning, however, that kind of binary approach really backfires. So I mentioned ambition was a moral trait. And part of what makes Macbeth last as a story is because ambition is both a virtue and a vice, depending on your context. And so he was able to really create, yes, uses of enchantment, that's right. So Shakespeare was able to kind of like make this character almost desirable. Like people like playing Macbeth because he's an interesting character. Same thing with Hamlet. They all want to play this well-rounded character. The trick is that, as you become better at storytelling, you want to hide your message. I'll give you an example. A rabbi is asked to settle a disagreement between two guys. So he listens to both of them very intently. And at the end, after they've shared what they have to share, he turns to one guy and he says, on the one hand, you're right. Then he looks at the other man and he says, on the other hand, you're right. A third guy who's watching the whole thing going down, he interrupts and he says, Rabbi, come on. They can't both be right. Surely only one of them is right. The rabbi looks at him and goes, you are also right. What's the dramatic premise? What's the core premise of that? It'll take people weeks, months, sometimes even years to unpack certain stories. And the thing that's beautiful about that is like, as long as it's fine if there are multiple interpretations of what it might mean, as long as you know what that core premise is, as long as you, the author, know what the sole meaning is, it will rattle around in people's brains forever. And that is learning retention. That's the real power here. Tina, you asked, so it's basically a formula, moral trait plus conflict plus conclusion, and we should have the key components to incorporate storytelling and learning. So the formula identifies what a core premise is. The core premise allows you to translate your learning objective into a similar core premise, and then you just find stories that align. Does that make sense? That's the basic building block of storytelling. There are more, and we cover it in the course, but the basic building block of what your story really is about is the core premise, and without it, you don't have a story. Yes, Allison, I will explain the formula again. So the moral trait is a virtue or a vice that embodies the human experience. It's stuff that we do throughout our lives, because characters aren't real people. They're machinations of people. They're like these facades of people, right? Oedipus doesn't really exist. He's a character that represents pride. Macbeth doesn't really exist. He's a character that represents ambition. We think of them as real because they're so simply motivated. Because they have a certain trait, it leads them to behave in ways that don't necessarily serve them. And once they grow and adapt and change, then they can get the reward. If they don't, they're destroyed by it. So the formula basically starts out with, you have a moral trait. Because of that moral trait, it's preventing the character from what he or she really wants. And therefore, if they don't change to get what they really want, they're going to be destroyed, or they'll be successful if they manage to. So, Gene, it's not actually related to Campbell's archetypes, because Campbell's trying to catalog a wide array of myths into a monomyth, into a singular myth. That's why you have that, descent into the cave. The reality is that stories don't all align to that. It's one aspect. And so these kinds of things, and this is the tricky part, Tina, right? When we talk about formulas, is that we don't want them to feel inorganic. And the core premise is one that doesn't restrict you. It organically allows you to tell whatever story you want, but it unifies that causal equation between a character doing something in order to get a thing. That's really all stories are. The monomyth, which was basically Campbell saying, anthropologically, all these different types tell similar stories. It's kind of been disproven as we find out more about neuroscience. But again, that wasn't his ultimate aim. I just want to clarify, you can tell lots of different kinds of stories. And whatever feels right and whatever resonates with you is what you should focus on. But use that framework to start by saying, this is the thing that's going to work, right? This is the thing that's going to align with the learning objective. As I said, to get into the actual construction is a bit more involved. We do walk you through this process, and we do talk about these archetypes, but it's in a context that will be a lot clearer and more cogent than I would be right now. Yeah, well, Austin just piped up and was like, 3x structure, because we hate it here. Everybody refers to you have to have 3x structure, and there are so many movies that don't follow it. Television's written in 9 acts, and it's something I don't want people to get bogged down in, because when I was starting filmmaking, I was in a film school, and I talked to my professor, and I was like, I want to make my movie. I ended up dropping out, and I went back to see him and said, I'm ready to, I've been learning on the streets. I want to make movies. And he says, well, I got a guy in Chicago who can help you. Give him a call. So I call him up, and he says, oh, Bruce told me about you. Tell me about your idea. And I was like, oh man, all this stuff. No one's ever seen this kind of thing, blah, 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 blah. And I'm just rambling a million miles an hour. And he goes, awesome. Would love to see a script. And I'm like, oh God, I don't have a script. So I'm like, any format things or books that will help me format it? So he recommends a bunch of books, and Sid Field's book comes up, which is the proponent of the 3x structure. Read the book cover to cover numerous times. Couldn't write a script. Didn't help me at all. So I don't want to feel like, I don't want you to be imprisoned by the idea of it has got to conform to the structure. These things are debilitating. But the organic formula I have now is it's scaffolding. You can build anything you want on this. Gene, yeah, I know this, I hope this doesn't feel complicated. I appreciate you offering this. I know all of you are storytellers. You do tell stories in your daily life. One thing that helped me a lot, I'll mention this, is I got a journal, and I just started writing down memories that I had. And they don't lead to anything, but it's an interesting exercise for you to be able to do. So I picked the first 10 years of my life, and I thought, what's the earliest memory I have? I just wrote about it. And I found that it was interesting, how I would paint the picture for someone who wasn't there. The real truth in this entire thing is you don't have to have a background or a degree in this stuff. I don't have a degree in this stuff. You just need to actually apply it. So when you get the worksheet, when I finally figured it out and send it to you, it all will be clear. If you have any questions, you have my email. So please reach out to me directly. Is there anything else that I can answer for you while we are here? Again, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Yes, intentional practice. Yes, I do have an example of a core premise. So the one that we used for this food safety training was, it was not traditionally in the way that I've taught you how to tell it, but it was the standard you walk by is the standard you accept. So that was a quote from a general, and it was really what epitomized the stakeholders' belief that if you let this happen, if you settle on something and you walk past it, it's going to bite you later on. And so for soft skills, anything that is that is nuanced, using this formula will help. You just have to get to the root of it, right? So instead of saying something like, well, if the operators, well, let's see, give me an example of something that you want to work on, and we'll workshop it right here briefly, if you don't mind. What's a core premise, or what's a learning objective, a soft skills learning objective that you want to change? Okay, so we've got making leaders better coaches of talent. Great. What's going to make them better coaches of talent? What's the thing? What's the vice that's preventing them, or what's the virtue they need to embrace? So Jay, you had attitude reflects leadership. So the end state of leadership, let's talk about that. What's the outcome of that? What do you want to see them do? Or what happens if they don't do it? Serve their people and team. Okay, so we've got make time for people, not just business results. So the thing is, there still needs to be a little bit of workshopping to distill this down to the core. So one example I would give for what sounds something like what you're saying might be that relationships lead to sales. So instead of making time for people, not just because it's business, relationships lead to sales. I need a story in which somebody treated another person in a relational fashion, and that's what led to their success. So think of like The Go-Giver. It's a great book that has this. And they constantly prove it. Like, in order to get what you want, you have to, be in service to others. So that's a great example of a soft skill. If you haven't read the book, highly recommend it. It's a good read. And it's a little bit cheesy in parts, but I think it does a very good job of using this formula, and you can apply it as your case is a great easy read. It's available on audiobook, and they revised it. So the soft skills thing you're really trying to focus on is to be really polarized and extreme with what the outcomes are going to be, to be very, very clear. So, for example, making leaders better coaches of talent, what's the end result? Talent will lead to what? What's the core thing? If it's sales, great. If it's sustaining, keeping the company alive, then it's our survival. That relationships lead to survival. Right? Good relationships or nurturing relationships lead to thriving. Now you've got some core premises that work within a soft skills space. Does that make sense? I know this seems like a bit of a circuitous process, and it is, but you guys have got some great information here, and with a tiny bit of guidance, I think that like you can be off and running. I hope that the framework helps. Again, if you have issues, let me know. But now you've got stories. If you just sit quietly for, like I said, 25 minutes and just ideate, all of this stuff will come up. All right. Anything else? Stillness is key. Yeah, there's a guy that I absolutely love. He's a Iranian filmmaker. Highly recommend him. He's like one of the absolute top 10 best directors ever. And he wrote a book called Lessons with Kiarostami, which is about his how to make short films. And in the foreword of the book, Mike Lay, who's another filmmaker, talks about meeting this guy. He's a very eccentric guy, and he used to do a bunch of large-scale landscape portraits. And one day he's filming this, one day he's walking through the school, and he sees him sitting down, waiting for one of his large photos to print. The printer takes like 90 minutes, and this guy, Kiarostami, is just sitting there watching it print out. And I always remember that, because as you start reading the book, you're like, he's teaching you to see. He talks about his grandmother sitting on the porch being like, oh, look at that mountain over there. Oh, look at that plant. Look at that bird. And she just was a filmmaker, he said, cutting things in her mind. So I really think that it's good for us to embrace and have time to think. Tina, yes, I will be sharing this, the playback. I'm going to follow up with a playback. We'll actually host it through like a private link on YouTube or something, so that you can watch it. I will be in communication with you guys. I have your email, unless you don't want me to be. I understand. But yes, you'll get all this information. So the playback, the handout, and then the link to the discounted pre-purchase. Anything else lingering? I'm going to give you 2 minutes, then I'm going to wrap this up. Yeah, Gene, I think you would love Bettelheim. It's a really, really great read. I mean, he wrote this in the 70s, but so much of it's applicable today. I also wanted to mention, there's this guy, Vladimir Prop. He wrote a bunch of essays on Russian folktales, and the dude uses mathematical formulas to explain the stories. And I'm just like, that to me was where my brain broke, and I'm like, I'm done with this. Had to find a simpler way. Awesome. Thank you, Katie. Really appreciate all of you. All right, I'm going to close this down for now. But again, thank you for your time. If you have any questions or if something wasn't jiving, please reach out to me and I'm happy to answer questions. You've got this. You are great storytellers. You can do this. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you create. All right, take care, everyone.